Good evening, everyone. I see the room is populating with faces and pictures and thumbnails of everyone, so I know people are all floating in from the waiting room. We're going to get started in just a moment here. We're letting everyone connect in from the waiting room. We have enabled live transcript, so if you need the closed caption, you'll have to enable it on your end on Zoom. They have been enabled. For those of you that are going to be watching this as a recording, we're sorry you couldn't be here with us live, and we hope that you enjoy tonight's event. Give it about one more minute here, and then we will get started. While you're all floating in, just to let you know, all of the questions, if you have things that come up throughout the presentation, you can drop them in the chat, and we will have time for a dedicated Q&A after the presentation. Now I'd like to introduce Sari Hartman from our Board of Directors and our Chair of our Social Action Committee.
Good evening. As Eileen mentioned, my name is Sari Hartman, and I serve on the board of Beth Israel and as chair of the Social Action Committee. On behalf of the Social Action Committee and our co-sponsors, the Men's Club and the Israel Committee, I welcome you to tonight's important conversation, Anti-Zionism is almost always anti-Semitism. This is the latest installment in our series of social action programs addressing topics related to anti-Semitism. We heard from many of you that the current rhetoric regarding anti-Zionism and its relationship to anti-Semitism required a deeper examination, so we enlisted tonight's guest, Micha Danzig, to guide us through that discussion. Micha served in the Israeli army and is a former police officer with the NYPD. He is currently an attorney and is very active with numerous Jewish and pro-Israel organizations, including as a founding partner in the hashtag #EndJewHatred movement and as a board member with Stand With Us and Herut. Micha has authored many articles related to Israel and fighting anti-Semitism, which have been published by the Jewish Journal, Allgemeiner, the San Diego UT, the Forward, Times of Israel, and the JNS. And he has appeared as a guest on shows like The Tipping Point, The Daily Ledger, and Vice News, where he has been called on to discuss matters related to anti-Semitism, Israel, and the Middle East. Thank you, Micha, for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Sari, and thank you everybody here from Beth Israel for having me here to speak on this important topic. So you'll note in the first slide of my PowerPoint, there's a question mark at the end, Anti-Zionism, the new anti-Semitism. And in the title for this presentation, this talk, it said, is anti-Zionism the new anti-Semitism, or anti-Zionism almost always anti-Semitism? Those are different versions of it. And so my caveat at the beginning is that there's two instances where I will concede that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. And those are the only two. And I welcome anybody at the end of this discussion to tell me there's a third. But the two are, one, if you are a true outright Marxist and you believe that no people, no ethnicity should have a state of their own. That means you also don't believe that the Palestinian people should have a state of their own. And since almost every anti-Zionist is also a fervent advocate for what I would consider to be a third Palestinian state in the Levant, then they are automatically disqualified from that. The second instance where anti-Zionism isn't, in my opinion, anti-Semitism is if you're part of that very small group of Jews, Neturei Karta, who mistakenly believe that your Jewish faith actually says that we can't have a Jewish state until God just hands it to us, right? And gives it to us on a silver platter, so to speak. So if you fall in either of those two categories, then your anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. But for the 99.9% of the world that doesn't fall into those categories, your anti-Zionism is ultimately anti-Semitic, or it's informed by anti-Semitic beliefs. So that's the start of this presentation. So first of all, we have to decide, we have to say, what is Zionism? Because we're talking about being anti-Zionism. So Zionism is very straightforward, and we shouldn't allow other people to define it for us, because this is what Zionism has been since its inception at its core. It's the belief that the Jewish people are entitled to the right of self-determination and sovereignty in their indigenous homeland, the land of Israel. That's what Zionism is, nothing else. So if you are against Zionism, this is what you are against. And that's critical to understand. But we also have to recognize that the rhetoric about Zionism and the attempt to turn Zionism into frankly, a dirty word, right, is out there, and that there are people of good conscience, right, that may have been taught to believe, or at least are adjacent to this belief, that Zionism is somehow equivalent to racism, right? And because of the rhetoric, and some of us are old enough to recall the 1976 UN resolution to say that Zionism is racism, right? That correlation comes to mind. But we have to understand that whether it comes from ignorance or malice, right, it's wrong. But as I always say in my advocacy, right, whether my advocacy is on social media or in writing or in some other format, I'm not preaching or discussing things or advocating things to change the minds of the malicious. That can happen every now and then. And when you do, that's an amazing win. But for the most part, we're really here to talk to people and understand what Zionism is for ourselves, so that when we meet people who are just ignorant of it, and maybe they're making a negative association with something that's so fundamental to the Jewish people as the belief that we have a right to be sovereign and have self-determination in our indigenous homeland, that they understand what that means. And that saying you're opposed to Zionism, you're anti-Zionist, to a Jewish person is equivalent to saying, I don't believe you have a right to a state that can defend you and your people, notwithstanding your 2,000 years of history that demonstrate that you really do need that state, right? So that is what our mission, or something my mission, is about. So I think a good start for this discussion, right, maybe to talk about some great civil rights activists, Christian civil rights activists, and Zionists. And the first one I like to talk about, of course, is one I wrote about recently in the San Diego Union Tribune, because MLK Day just happened recently, and that's MLK. MLK was very clear about this. He said, when people criticize Zionists, they mean Jews, right? You are talking anti-Semitism. And we'll get into more about why MLK was flat out right. But that was MLK's perspective when he was asked a question at Harvard about that was pointedly referring to the Zionists, which again, that's a common trick we see nowadays. And it was even back in 1967 and 68 that people would try to avoid, because especially back in 1968, being outright anti-Semitic was even less popular in many respects than it is today, right? And particularly because we were much more proximate to the Holocaust. So rather than be seen as being anti-Semitic or espousing pure Jew hatred, it's much more politically correct to couch it as being opposed to Zionism or the Zionists. Eldridge Cleaver, also former Black Panther, wrote that to condemn the Jewish survival doctrine of Zionism as racism is a travesty upon the truth, right? And that was in response to the Zionism is racism resolution in the UN, the one I just spoke about before. I mean, that's pretty powerful stuff, because that is, it's why I'm a Zionist, because I believe that at least in large respect, that it is the Jewish survival doctrine. There's other reasons why I'm a Zionist, but that's a pretty important one, considering 1/3 of our population worldwide was wiped out in 4 years because we didn't have a Jewish state. So we're on here. Sorry, I'm having some technical issues here. And for some reason, this slide is not populating. All right. All right, here we go. So the bottom line is that if you believe the Jewish people have a right to sovereignty in part of their indigenous homeland, then you're a Zionist. That's all that means. And as I'm sure most of the people participating in this Zoom know, that you don't have to be a Jew to be a Zionist, the same way you don't have to be a woman to believe in equal rights for women, or an African American to believe in civil rights for African Americans, right? MLK was a Zionist, right? Eldridge Cleaver was a Zionist. We know many non-Jewish Zionists because, again, from my perspective, it's important to understand that Zionism equals justice, and you don't have to be a Jew, obviously, to believe in justice. But it's also important to understand what Zionism doesn't require you to believe in, right? Zionism doesn't require you to believe that Israel is perfect and that Israel makes no mistakes. And that's where we always get this red herring, right? That people say that if you criticize Israel, right, that then you'll be called an anti-Semite by the people who defend Israel, or by people like me, or groups like Stand With Us, and that's simply false. It's a red herring. I don't know of any person who does what I do, who spends a lot of time, frankly, defending Israel and fighting against anti-Semitism in the public sphere, that says that criticism of Israel, the way you would criticize, or Israeli policies, the way you would criticize any country or their policies, is anti-Semitic, right? But being anti or critical of Israeli policies, or certain policies, is not the same as being anti-Zionist, right? Because as a Zionist, one can certainly disagree with Israel's policies, and one certainly, as frankly, almost all of Israel's population, at some point or time, criticize her government. I mean, so a recent survey in Israel identified that 90+% of all of Israeli citizens identify themselves as Zionists. So that means that they just simply agree that Jews have a right to self-determination and sovereignty in part of their indigenous homeland. Clearly, anybody who's familiar with Israeli politics, with the Knesset, with Israeli media, right, knows that among that 90% of the population, almost every person has at times vociferously criticized the Israeli government or Israeli government policies. Now, they're not anti-Semitic for doing so, and they're certainly not anti-Zionist because they identify themselves as Zionists. The difference is, if you're an anti-Zionist, you're literally taking away Israel's right to exist as a state for the Jewish people. That's fundamentally different than being critical of the Israeli government or certain government policies or actions. So if you believe, as an anti-Zionist must, that the Jewish people don't deserve to have an independent state in their indigenous homeland, that ultimately means you believe the Jewish people are the only people in the world that don't deserve a state. Then what that does mean is that you are anti-Jewish, right? You're anti-Semitic. Just as a person who doesn't believe that French people don't deserve a state must be anti-French. It's pretty straightforward. Someone more eloquent than me by far, and one of my favorite speakers of all time, Abba Eban, former UN ambassador for Israel when Israel first became a state, and also later foreign minister of Israel, said there is no difference whatever between anti-Semitism and the denial of Israel's statehood. Classical anti-Semitism denies the equal right of Jews as citizens within society. Anti-Zionism denies the equal right of the Jewish people its lawful sovereignty within the community of nations. The common principle in the two cases is discrimination. That was Abba Eban in the New York Times in 1975. You'll often hear when we talk about, or when people explain what is anti-Semitic about certain attacks on Israel, is the concept of the double standard. Natan Sharansky famously coined the phrase, the 3Ds, that, quote, to be able to look at when criticism of Israel crosses over into the kind of criticism we would apply to any country and its actions, and becomes anti-Semitic or based on Jew hatred. And that is the 3 Ds again, are demonization, double standards, and legitimization. Tough one, the last one, right? So the double standard comes off loud and clear when we talk about the right of the Jewish people to an independent state. The Armenian people have an independent state in their indigenous homeland, relatively newly freed from occupation, just as our state was. The Japanese people have an independent state. Arabs obviously have 22 independent states. And the Jewish people who had sovereignty in the land of Israel before any of these people certainly deserve to have an independent state of their own in their indigenous homeland. And this, again, is Zionism. And this is something that is central to Judaism. And so if you're anti this, right, anti-Zionism, then you're anti the Jewish people. So we have the old anti-Semitism. Jews are evil, demonic, and they kill babies. This goes back centuries, these canards. The new anti-Semitism, the Jewish state is evil, demonic, and they kill babies, right? I think it says it pretty straightforward. And again, we'll be talking about the recycling of these types of canards and common tropes that were applied to Jews throughout the centuries as a means of otherizing us, as a means of inciting violence against us, and as a means of rationalizing anti-Semitic attacks on us or our institutions as individuals and as a collective. So anti-Zionism versus anti-Semitism, what's the difference? Well, anti-Semitism, very simply, is Jew hatred or hatred of the Jewish people. Anti-Zionism, hatred of the Jewish state, right? Two sides of the same coin, effectively. Core beliefs of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Of course, whenever you're talking about something, you got to go, like we talked about, what is Zionism? Well, let's talk about what are the core beliefs of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. One core belief of anti-Semitism: Jews, because they are Jewish, are not entitled to equal rights, are not entitled to live with us as equals in our society. Core belief of anti-Zionism: unlike all other peoples, Jews are not entitled to self-determination. And again, that's why I said, if you're one of the rare people that don't believe there should be any states, right? If you just want one big Marxist utopia where we all live with under one government and there's no state borders anymore, then this probably doesn't apply to you. Core belief 2 of anti-Zionism: Jews are the root cause of all or most of the world's problems. Again, this is straight from the protocols of the elders of Zion, the Tsar's forgery from the early part of or the late part, I should say, of the 19th century, all the way through into Hitler's Mein Kampf and Julius Streicher in Der Stürmer, right? What's the core belief of anti-Zionism? That Israel, the Jewish state, is the root cause of all or most of the world's problems, or certainly at least all of the problems in the Middle East, which we hear that all the time. If Israel just went away, the Middle East would be, and North Africa would be a marvelous place. What's the ultimate goal or aim of the anti-Semite versus the anti-Zionist? Well, the anti-Semite, the virulent one at least, wants to end the Jewish people. The anti-Zionist wants to end the Jewish state. What are the foundations of these two respective beliefs? Well, anti-Semitism, the foundation is discriminating against and demonization of Jews based on lies and propaganda about our history and our behavior, right? We can go back all the way to medieval times and see over and over again examples of how the root and foundation of anti-Semitism was to discriminate against us and demonize us based on lies and propaganda about us and our behavior. Anti-Zionism has the same foundational roots, right? It's discriminating against and demonizing the Jewish state based on lies and propaganda about Israel's history and behavior. And we see this cartoon here on the side, which is, again, obviously just the caricature alone, which is so funny, right? So they're trying in this cartoon to make fun of Jews and claiming that we cry anti-Semitism whenever somebody's just, quote, criticizing Israel or advocating for Palestinian Arabs. So you have this much more attractive looking guy on the right wearing Palestinian Arab colors with a sign that says Free Palestine and Occupation. And then you have a truly kind of grotesque caricature of what a Jew looks like with payas, a kippah, and a huge rifle and a gun, right, to guard his sheep, screaming anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism. I mean, this was meant to criticize us, to make fun of us for claiming that anti-Zionists are anti-Semitic, when in fact their very cartoon itself screams that it's anti-Semitic. So it's rich with irony. So what are the common beliefs of anti-Zionism versus anti-Semitism? We see this. We've seen this in the 18th century, and the 19th century, and certainly in the early parts of the 20th century, with regard to the virulent type of anti-Semitism that led to Jews being killed, the blood libels against Jews, Jews being forced out of different countries, even as early, frankly, as the 12th century. We see it now in so much of the rhetoric that attacks Israel. Jews are baby killers, Zionists are baby killers. Jews control the media, Zionists control the media. Jews did 9/11. We've seen that mostly among right-wing anti-Semites in America, right? But among left-wing anti-Semites and Islamist anti-Semites, we see the claim Zionists did 9/11. Anti-Semite Jews control Western countries. Again, that was something that Hitler spoke about a lot. So did the Tsars and the Tsar and his people in the Protocols of the Elder and the Zion, right? Anti-Zionists, Zionists control Western countries, in particular the U.S. government, right? ZOG, right, which stands for Zionist Occupied Government, is a common phraseology or term used by both the far right in America and the far left in America, right? By people who advocate for Students for Justice in Palestine, and the Muslim Student Association on campuses, as well as people who write for the Stormfront or David Duke. ZOG is a common phrase for both of them. Jews control banks, Zionists control banks. Jews are not from the Levant. There's no Jewish history in Israel. Zionists, Jews are not indigenous, no Jewish history in Israel. Now, interestingly, that last part, why I haven't read, is that prior to 1948, the anti-Semites, particularly in Europe, did not claim we weren't from the Levant and didn't claim we had no history in Israel. That is a relatively new phenomenon of anti-Semitism since 48, particularly in the 21st century. But before 1948, it was very clear to the Jew haters in Europe, whether it was Wilhelm Marr, who coined the phrase anti-Semitism, or to any other Jew hater through the centuries in Europe, that we were from the Levant and that we were Palestinians. We were called often Palestinians, right? Herodotus, the Greek historian in the 5th century BCE, was the first person to refer to the Levant, the Western Levant in particular, as Palestine. But he referred to the people of Palestine being circumcised and being Hebrews. And from that point forward, really until after 1948, the people who identified us as Palestinian and who identified as Palestinian were Jews, right? It's a little bit different topic, but it's important to understand. The demonization part, remember I talked before about Natan Sharansky's 3Ds. One of them is demonization. The demonization really hasn't changed much, which is what's pretty crazy, right? You have here a Nazi cartoon from 1938, right? And that shows a Jewish octopus really strangling and destroying the world. And then you have International Jew book cover from Egypt that has remarkably similar imagery, talking about the international Jew and his demonic hold on the world. Natan Sharansky again referred to delegitimization. Okay, so that's questioning whether or not Israel has the right to exist. This obviously challenges the right of Jews to self-determine in our homeland, right? Accusing Israel of stealing or colonizing what they call Palestinian land. These are all ahistorical, counterfactual, but they all serve to try to delegitimize Israel's existence. It's very, right to exist whatsoever, not whether it can exist or have any land in certain parts of our indigenous homeland, but whether we have a right to exist there at all, including even in just Tel Aviv, right? And here we have a cartoon from from Palestinian Authority media that shows exactly that type of all these different forms of anti-Semitism. You have the stereotypical religious Jew looking very evil, the big nose, the pitchfork shaped like a menorah with blood on it, skulls all around. And again, look, it's 1948. It's not 1967. It's 1948. And this poor girl holding a key to her home that was stolen from her by this pitchforked, malicious, malevolent looking Jew. More demonization, literal demonization. Palestinian Authority TV referring to Israel as Satan's offspring. I don't know if you can get more demonizing than that, right? And again, connecting Jews and the Jewish people to Satan and demons. If you go back and look at even medieval anti-Semitism, that was at a core way to propagandize and incite Jew hatred, to associate the Jewish people with Satan and with demonic forces. Let's talk about how we see this manifest itself also in our headlines, right? This was a CBS headline following a terrorist attack by 3 Arab terrorists who tried to stab people at the Damascus Gate in Jerusalem. They literally ran up on Jews, or I should say they ran up to the Damascus Gate, which is both has many Jews and non-Jews in it at any given time. But they were trying to find and stab Jews. This particular terrorist attack, they were able to kill one 19-year-old Israeli policewoman and seriously injure another female officer in an attack that actually included machine guns, pipe bombs, and knives. They came there to murder a lot of Jews. And only because of the bravery of these 2 female police officers were they prevented from doing so. The CBS News headline doesn't give you any indication of any of that. What it does do is it demonizes Israel, right? It said 3 Palestinians killed as daily violence grinds on. Daily violence, what a generic, banal way to portray what was attempted here, right? Which was the mass murder of Jews at the Damascus Gate in Jerusalem. But what do they focus on here? The 3 Palestinians killed, not why they were killed, not how, just 3 Palestinians killed. This is CBS News essentially assisting with the demonization of the one Jewish state. And they do so in a way that you would never see them do, and the same type of violence occurs anywhere else. And that's the double standard that Natan Sharansky spoke of. I mean, could you imagine this headline with the London terrorist attacks, right? After the June 4th, 2017 London Bridge terrorist attack, the headlines focused, every headline I saw focused on it being terrorism or focused on the victims. The headlines were terror in London, or London Bridge terror, 7 killed, dozens injured, and terror strikes London on eve of election, right? It wasn't what I changed it to be here. British police killed 3 Muslim civilians in shooting incidents. But that's what the headline looks like when the attack occurs in Israel. But when it occurs in London, the headline's completely different. Again, that's a double standard, and that double standard leads to demonization. So let's talk about other similarities between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Boycott similarities. Anti-Zionism, as I'm sure everybody on this Zoom knows, the Nazis singled out Jews and Jewish businesses for economic, cultural, and academic boycotts. But not just the Nazis. Towards the end of the 19th century, in Europe, the anti-Jewish boycott became one of the basic weapons of choice for victimizing the Jewish population. There was a first international anti-Jewish Congress in Dresden in 1882. And in there, they adopted a slogan and a referendum to not purchase from Jewish merchants and not to go to see or refer people to Jewish professionals. In Western Europe, the boycott took the form of excluding Jews from certain societies. And in Eastern Europe, there was a rapidly developing national bourgeoisie, which formed the mainstay of the right-wing parties in Eastern Europe. And they essentially used anti-Semitic tactics to squeeze out people Jews they viewed as competitors. And this anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish boycott was incredibly successful at that time period in many parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Austrian anti-Semites back then would actually publicize in the press and in public meetings slogan, "Don't buy from Jews." So boycotting Jews as a core feature or core component of anti-Semitism is obviously nothing new. And now, in the anti-Zionist version of anti-Semitism, the BDS campaign singles out the Jewish state and those who support it for economic, cultural, and academic boycotts. And if anybody wants to doubt for a second that this is anti-Semitic, setting aside the fact that, again, out of all the countries in the world, be it China, Egypt, Venezuela, etc., who are engaging in horrific, I should say, really, human rights violations. The only country that you single out for boycott, divest, and sanction is Israel. That's it. You're already anti-Semitic. But then you add to it that BDS campaigns have often targeted just Jews who don't even live in Israel. Matisiao, when he went to appear in Spain at a big music festival, the BDS campaigners campaigned against him getting a 1 hour slot to sing at that concert, at that festival. And for a time period, they succeeded. And Matisiao is not Israeli. He's just a proud Jew. And yet they targeted him for sanction. Cultural boycotts, as we talked about, in Nazi Germany, Jewish actors and athletes were not allowed to perform. Jewish books, plays, art, etc. were all banned. BDS also targets Jewish actors and Israeli actors and Jewish singers like Matisiao for sanction to prevent performance. Same for books that they believe or plays they believe are too supportive of Israel or of the Jews' right to live in the state of Israel. They also employ similar tactics. In Germany, non-Jews doing business with Jews were also threatened with boycott. In Germany, they enacted special laws to criminalize Jewish business and doing business with Jews. The anti-Zionists, what do? Non-Jews who are visiting or doing business with Jews or with the Jewish state are threatened with boycott, are threatened with sanctions, are threatened with being outside of the favor of the trendy and the people and the progressive movement. Right? Today, we see that there's many progressive movements and groups that want you to disclaim your Zionism, your love for Israel, or your belief that Jews have a right to a state of their own before they allow you entry, so to speak, to the club. Same thing. In the EU and the Arab leagues, they're trying to enact laws to sanction Jewish-owned Israeli businesses and those who do business with them. Again, the tactics haven't changed that much. So the bottom line, if you single out the Jewish people for denial of national rights, that's anti-Semitic. If you portray Jews who are indigenous to the land of Israel as foreign colonial intruders, or you refer to Israel's existence and the Jewish people being sovereign in the state of Israel as settler colonialism, essentially denying our connection to our indigenous land, our history, our faith, and our, as well as, frankly, archaeology itself, that's anti-Semitic. It's what's called erasure. If you hold Israel, and by extension, therefore, the Jewish people themselves, to a higher standard than you hold any other nation, and certainly to a higher standard than these people hold any other country in the Middle East and North Africa, then that's anti-Semitic. Libeling the Jewish state in ways that are remarkably consistent with how Jews were regularly libeled in the diaspora for almost 2,000 years, baby killers, bloodthirsty, money hungry, stealing money, things like that. That's anti-Semitic. And that's my presentation. Happy to answer questions.
I do see a few questions that have already come up in the chat. I didn't know if you wanted to scroll back and check those out while we wait for a few more to come in.
Let me see. Look at the chat.
And then after that, we've got Jay and then Jason.
All right, so. Okay. Herzl advocated the Uganda option in 1903. So isn't he an anti-Semite according to your definition of Zionist? Definitely not. So it's important to understand the context of what Herzl was advocating and what his view of Zionism was. So first of all, Herzl was really was a prophet in a way, right? A Navi, as we would say. He wrote in 1898 that the Jewish state was an imperative and that he feared for the body of the Jewish people if they were to remain in Europe much longer. He also wrote, by the way, that he felt like the Jewish state would be a reality within 50 years of the first Zionist Congress. He was pretty close on that. But he also said that if the Jews didn't get out of Europe within the next 50 years, that he feared that the body of the Jewish people would be destroyed. And sadly, he was remarkably prophetic about that. Herzl was a strong advocate for the Jewish state being in the land of Israel. His first efforts were all focused on the Ottoman Empire and the Sultan, and trying to get the Sultan to agree to allow Jews to immigrate in larger numbers to Ottoman-controlled Palestine. He failed in that regard. In the meantime, he was negotiating with all the world powers, including the British. There was the idea of a temporary Jewish state being placed in Argentina and Uganda was something that was put out there. Herzl did favor it. The other leading Zionists in the World Zionist Congress were opposed to it because they viewed that we had no business having a Jewish state in Uganda or Argentina. But Herzl did that because he rightly was very concerned that if we didn't have a state, that the Jewish people would be exterminated. And again, sadly, he was actually right about that. But Herzl also wasn't, he wasn't perfect. He also didn't believe that the Jewish state could revert back to our indigenous language and have a functioning Hebrew language as the spoken language of Israel. In that regard, he was very wrong too. So he wasn't perfect, but he certainly wasn't an anti-Semite. Let's see.
We've got Jay and then Jason, and then I see Glenda also wrote something in the chat.
All right.
Hi, Micha.
Yeah, I'm just going to answer the one question about the correct way to write anti-Semitism versus hyphenated. I think that it should be anti-Semitism without a hyphen because and we often hear, I get this a lot on social media when I say that someone's being anti-Semitic or these actions or words are anti-Semitic, and then they go, Arabs are Semites, so this can't be anti-Semitic. And I'm like, that's really a silly argument. It obviously avoids the substance of the issue, but also the reality is that the term anti-Semitism was coined by Wilhelm Marr in the late 1800s as a way to make Jew hatred seem more scientific, more rooted in our something that's about us that's not our faith, meaning that if we convert, we still are terrible, essentially. And Wilhelm Marr wanted the hatred of Jew hatred to survive any Jew converting. This concept, by the way, wasn't new at that time. The first racist codified laws in European history, and frankly, I think in world history, were in 1488 in Toledo, Spain. And they were laws that were they were Spanish purity of blood laws, and they were designed to prevent Jews who converted to Catholicism during the Spanish Inquisition from being able to hold certain positions and have certain privileges until they were at least 4th-generation, quote, Spaniard, meaning Catholic, right? So the idea that there was something terrible and dirty about Jewish blood, and that you would hate us not just for our faith, but for our ethnicity or race, is something that actually started in 15th century Spain. But Willem Marr really took it to the next level, of course, and that's where the term anti-Semitism comes from. And that's why when somebody says they're an anti-Semite, they're certainly not saying they're anti-Arab. Okay, so I think that covers the chat. So I'm happy to take any
Well,
other.
there are a few others, but why don't we go to some of the, I see Jason has his hand up, but yeah, there's a few in the chat about, I'm just scrolling up about how we as individuals deal with organized anti-Semitism. And there's a few others, but I see Jason has a hand up, and Jay as well. Jay, do you want to go first?
Yeah. Okay. Micha, well, first of all, I'd like to publicly thank you for your service in the IDF under the Lone Soldier Program.
Thank you.
That is a program that both the synagogue and the men's club have financially supported in the past. And I understand your son's, is he still in it?
No, my son has been out of the Army now for a year, but yes,
Oh,
he was
okay.
when he was a lone soldier, he certainly benefited from your support. Back when I was a lone soldier, I doubt I got any financial support. I'm a lot older.
Yeah. Anyway, my question was, something that saddens me lately is there's a new buzzword that the anti-Zionists are using called Israel is an apartheid state. And the use of that term, in my view, has resulted in many Reform Jews distancing themselves from Israel, where in the past they had supported Israel. And I find that very sad. So how do we address this untruth and try to turn around Jews that are now walking away from Israel?
Well, so first of all, I mean, I have an article coming out in the UT about this, specifically about the Amnesty International report. So hopefully it'll be coming out in the next couple of days. I submitted it to them on Monday, so they take their time at, getting these things out. But I submitted them on Monday. There's a couple of canards, and really important. I wrote an article about this a while back in the Jewish Journal. It's about cheapening of important historical terms. And in that article, I focused on apartheid and genocide, right? But there's another one, ethnic cleansing. So these are really, inflammatory trigger words, essentially, in that are used again to hit those two first D's, and that's demonizing and double standards. So when nothing in America and in European politics today is more of a third rail, so to speak, than apartheid. But very close to that is the accusation of genocide, and that's why those who want to delegitimize Israel so fervently and constantly apply these terms to Israel, even though they're square pegs being rammed into a round hole. They really have to change the definition of these key terms, and they so cheapen them by doing so. But that doesn't matter to them, because ultimately this is not about righting major wrongs or dealing with the most significant human rights violations in the world. It's about attacking the one Jewish state. So when you look at apartheid, right, what Amnesty International did and what all these people do is they don't take the definition of apartheid as it was, and it was in South Africa, right? And by the way, how the changing of the definition is uniquely to attack Israel, because apartheid is an Afrikaner word, right? This is literally a South African Afrikaner invention, right? That was limiting the rights of the citizens of a country based on their race or color, right? So in Israel, obviously, as anybody who's been to Israel knows, there's no limitation on the rights of citizens based on ethnicity, faith, color, or anything of that sort. Just this past week, Israel announced that a Muslim Arab is going to be on its Supreme Court. A Christian Arab on Israel's Supreme Court about 15 years ago sentenced the Jewish president of the country to prison. An Arab Christian is the chairman of the board of Israel's largest bank, Bank Leumi. And I could go on and on and on and on. So clearly there are no laws or prohibitions or diminution of rights and civil rights or ability to progress in Israeli society that is based on one's race, color, or ethnicity or faith. Again, if you were in apartheid South Africa and you were a Black person, you couldn't walk into a white person's bank. There's no such thing as a Jewish person's bank in Israel. So this whole thing is obviously completely wrong. And what they do is they change the definition and they make it such that really that definition could apply to any country, right? They say fragmentation is apartheid. They say that so meaning that you have communities that are fragmented. So there's an Arab village here, an Arab village there. That's apartheid. Well, if that's the case, then many parts of America are apartheid because we have many neighborhoods that are predominantly one ethnicity or another in this country. That's not the definition of apartheid. And then they say things like, and then they go, oh, they say there's, and then they just lie. They say there's Jewish roads in the West Bank. No, there aren't. There's roads for Israeli citizens and non-citizens, right? And that's a big difference. An Arab citizen of Israel drives on the same roads as a Jewish citizen of Israel. And they try to ignore the fact that all of these things that exist in Judea and Samaria, what we call the West Bank, is because of security reasons, and not just because we want to be arbitrary and capricious, right? But they discount the security. The Amnesty International report refers to Hamas 3 times in 210 pages, refers to rocket attacks, never, right? They act like all these things don't exist, and that all that exists is the steps that Israel takes to defend itself. But to answer your question, how do we get people who are listening to these slurs, these canards, these tropes, and bring them back into the fold? I think it's got to be through education and reaching out and really trying to bring these people back. They have to Jewish pride, understanding our history, understanding why these things exist, understanding these things don't occur in a vacuum. That has to be our mission. I think Jason was next.
So thanks, Micha. I largely agree with you on the presentation, but there were 2 points that you brought up that I would like some clarification on. You mentioned that criticism of Israel inherently itself is not anti-Semitic. So I would point out Ben and Jerry's was accused of being anti-Semitic. President Obama was accused of being anti-Semitic. Various members of Congress are accused of being anti-Semitic. The Democratic Party is accused of being anti-Semitic. Many of them seem to be criticizing Israeli policies. So can you give us an example of somebody prominent who has criticized Israeli policies that isn't anti-Semitic?
Sure. So Ben and Jerry's is, because they, not necessarily when they criticize a specific policy, but when they decide to boycott, Israel of all the different countries in the world, or boycott selling in Judea and Samaria, or selling to Jews in Judea and Samaria out of all the different places in the world, that to me is anti-Semitic because they don't do it anywhere else, right? But you brought up President Obama. I don't believe President Obama is anti-Semitic. I think he's wrong. I think he was wrong on some of his criticisms of Israel. But when he's criticizing, for example, Israel's views on the Iran nuclear deal, right? I don't think that's anti-Semitic. I think people can disagree on what's the best approach to preventing Iran from becoming a military nuclear power. That would be an example where you could be critical of Israel and not be anti-Semitic, because I think there's lots of people, for example, who would be critical of other countries that believe that the only way to resolve a problem with a virulent dictatorship is through sanctions and force, and that the carrot and stick approach has been debated throughout history. So whether you agree with the carrot or the stick, that isn't necessarily inherently grounded in anti-Semitism. Just one example. Next question.
Eric, I see you have a hand up.
Thank you. And thank you for your presentation. I have some real concerns that you have not acknowledged the occupation in the West Bank and the effects that that has on coming to recognize that there are possibly two narratives regarding the War of Independence, and to only recognize one of them does a disservice to 2.5 million people that are living under the occupation. Rabbi Daniel Hartman from the Hartman Institute, the president of the Hartman Institute, talks a lot about those of us who are very troubled but committed to the state of Israel, as I consider myself. But I have lots of concerns when we try to do justice for ourselves, but we are not just to those that we control. So my question is, how do we get to a point where we recognize the rights and the narratives of other indigenous people in the land of Israel?
Okay, well, I mean, so you covered a lot of ground there. First and foremost, whether what one's perspective or position is on how to address the rights and the claims of the Palestinian Arabs living in Judea and Samaria or living in Gaza, none of that really plays a role in what my presentation was about, which is that being anti-Zionist is anti-Semitic, and or plays a role in the fact that the methods and the use of anti-Zionism, whether it's to deny the right of the Jewish people that they have any history in the state of Israel, to demonize Israel, to make claims, for example, that that Israelis, sterilize Palestinians, or we poison their water, or things like that, are all basically, treading upon worn ground of the old anti-Semitic canards that are just being regurgitated over and over again, right? Those are just two very different things. And as you noted, there are people in the Hartman Institute, there are many people in Israeli politics, or many Israelis, who believe that the best thing that Israel can do is to, as quickly as possible, leave most of Judea and Samaria and provide independence, of some form of independent statehood to the Arabs that live there. I would never say those Jews are anti-Semitic, right? I personally think they're wrong, but I don't think they're anti-Semitic. So that's one. In terms of the idea that there are other indigenous people, that's not a subject matter of this PowerPoint or this presentation, but I would disagree with you. You don't get to be indigenous just by being somewhere a long time, right? Indigeneity comes from ethnogenesis. It comes from having a consistent culture that was originated in a region. Arabs are in Judea and Samaria, and they're in the rest of the land of Israel because Arab conquerors colonized and conquered the land of Israel, as well as the rest of the Middle East and North Africa in the 7th century and thereafter. Conquering an area and then forcing most of the people that live in that area to adopt your culture, adopt your language, adopt your faith, right, doesn't make you indigenous. If it was, then frankly, every descendant of any European or any person that became a English-speaking Christian in America for generations would now be indigenous to North America, and they're not, right? There's only the indigenous to North America are Native American tribes whose faith holds this land as the land they came from is holy, who speak a language uniquely developed in this land, who have a history that is unique and only to this land, right? And that's Native Americans. The Jews are the Native Americans in the land of Israel. That's it. And about 1,000 Samaritans. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't have rights of longstanding presence in a land. And Zionism and Zionists always agreed to that idea, that notwithstanding the fact that Arabs in the land of Israel or in the Levant are certainly not indigenous, they have rights of longstanding presence. And that's why since 1937, 8 times we've offered them a state, right? We've either agreed to or offered them a state. Occupation, which certainly exists because we share control of that land and about 2 million people with the Palestinian Authority, persists because the problem that led to the occupation hasn't been solved, right? I was a soldier in Judea and Samaria. My son was a soldier in Judea and Samaria. I don't want soldiers, working with or frankly defending Israel from civilians in Judea and Samaria any more than most people do, right? But until we figure out a way to do this in a way that doesn't lead to more bloodshed and more death of Jews, we have to be there, right? We got out of Gaza lock, stock, and barrel in 2005, and that did not work out well for us. So, and right now, there's groups out there like Habayit in Israel that are working to create ties with our Palestinian Arab cousins and to try to end the demonization and anti-Semitism that is so ripe in their society. If they're successful, then there will be those seeds can be planted that can lead to a disengagement, autonomy, and eventually statehood. But until then, I don't see it happening.
I don't see any more hands raised, but if you wanted to give a scroll through the chat, feel free. I know we have a few more minutes here. And if anyone else wants to raise their hand and ask a question or read their question from the chat, please feel free to raise hands.
Okay, so I see one here. Prominent Israeli security officials and experts have talked about the occupation as immoral and damaging Israel, and a few even suggest that Israel could be on the road to apartheid. Is it anti-Semitic for others to raise the same concerns? Again, most security officials in Israel certainly don't believe that we are in a position right now where we can safely disengage from Judea and Samaria and leave that area to essentially what would happen is if we pulled out of Judea and Samaria the way we pulled out of Gaza, the same thing that happened in Gaza would happen in Judea and Samaria, but instead of it being in a very relatively far from Israel center and Jerusalem and its main international airport, it would be right on top of all those things. Literally 5 million people would be within mortar rounds of fire of a Hamas-controlled Judea and Samaria. So there are very few prominent Israeli security officials that believe that we can actually leave at this point. Again, this road to apartheid, if anybody who says that is completely, just like when they claim that Israel's engaging in genocide, and again, even if you're an Israeli who says this, you're just completely misusing a very, very inflammatory trigger word and changing its meaning completely to slam it like a super square peg into a very round hole, right? And no Jew should do it. And if you're doing it, it's just wrong, right? The Israel haters accuse Israel of genocide all the time, right? Genocide is not a situation where a population has gone from 1 million people in 1948 to 11 million people in 2020. Just not, right? And apartheid when everyone pictures apartheid in South Africa, they know it. They know it's white-only bathrooms, white-only fountains, white-only banks, white-only beaches, no Black people being allowed to hold any government offices, no Black people being allowed to go to university, and many other horrible things that apartheid actually was. To compare that to Israel in any way, shape, or form is simply inapplicable, and it's frankly disgusting. And if an Israeli does it, I'll tell them that same thing. See, how do I propose balancing Jewish rights to Palestine with the rights of Palestinians to serve land? Do I deny they have equivalent rights to the land? Yes, I deny they have equivalent rights to the land. 100%. They're not indigenous. It's not their indigenous homeland. In 1921, right? Or excuse me, 1917, the international community recognized that there should be a Jewish state, a Jewish homeland in Palestine. At that point, Palestine was not defined as everything west of the Jordan River. It never had a definition. Historic Palestine is a misnomer, but Palestine back then was all of what is today Israel and Jordan. And in 1921, the British colonial secretary, a guy named Winston Churchill, took 78% of the Palestine Mandate and made out of it an Arab state. So they got a state. And then in 1937, we agreed, as the Jewish agency and the Jewish people in that land agreed to a partition of the remaining 22%. The Arab side said no. They said, hell no. And they attacked us and tried to kill us. 1948, the same thing happened. So no, I don't believe they have the same equivalent rights. Have we offered them states since then in parts in Judea and Samaria and Gaza? Yes. Has the response to it been to try to kill us and say no to it? Yes. So until they're willing to demonstrate that they're willing to live with us in peace, no. I don't believe they have the same rights. Arab Israeli citizens, by the way, do have the same rights, right? And they're the only Arabs in the entire Middle East and North Africa that have full civil rights and right to vote in actual meaningful elections, right? So no, it's not the same thing.
I see a number of people with hands up. This is Marty Stern. Let me call on these people. Please try to make your question quick. And Micha, I've got to ask you to make your question quick. Bar, was your hand up? Bar Goldberg?
No, it's not.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Jason Berkovich, and then Lawrence.
Sure, thanks, Mark. So quick, because the topic is anti-Zionist and anti-Semitism. Obviously, Jews can't agree on whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. We see JVP running around proudly calling themselves anti-Zionists. So how do we get non-Jews to understand that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism when you have groups like JVP running around being so proud about their anti-Zionism?
Yeah, look, it's always the issue, right? I mean, that's part of any racism, right? Tokenism is part and parcel of any version of racism, right? If I tokenize an African-American person, I mean, we saw it all the time with the when Trump was president, or when Trump was running for president, people would point to the one or two African Americans in a large "Make America Great" rally and say, "See, Black people love Trump," right? And they do the same thing with Mexican Americans. When Trump would say something horrible about Mexican people, he'd be like, "Oh, he didn't say anything horrible about Mexicans. See, this Mexican guy's voting for Trump." So tokenizing a Jewish person, right, or tokenizing JVP, which represents maybe 1% of the Jewish world, or tokenizing the Neturei Karta, who represent 10,000 people total in the Jewish world, right, is anti-Semitic in and of itself, right? So that would be my answer. You don't fight anti-Semitism by being anti-Semitic. And when you're tokenizing one group of Jews or tokenizing one Jew, you're being anti-Semitic.
Lawrence and then Jay.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, thank you so much. Micha, awesome presentation. Thank you so much. I just want to know, what is your opinion on the future of Israel with regards to the conflict? Do you favor more of a two-state solution if Arabs, Palestinians were to come to a peace agreement, or do you see it going in the direction of a one-state federation if Israel were to extend citizenship to all those who live in the region? As we both know, Arabs and Jews are neither going to be leaving the land ever. And I wanted to know, what is your take on the future of the region?
So you asked me two questions. I want you to tell me which one you want me to answer. I guess I could answer both, but you asked me, one, what do I think is going to happen? And two, what do I want to happen?
Yes, yeah.
So do you want me to answer both of those?
If you could, yeah, if possible.
Sure. All right.
Yeah.
So I'll answer first what I think will happen, because I'm not the king of the world and I can't make things happen. So what I think is going to happen is that we're going to see the status quo sadly persist for quite a while. Okay. The Palestinian Authority, because we really have, when people talk about a two-state solution, they forget that really, as I said at the beginning of this presentation, or towards the beginning of the presentation, that's already, there was a two-state solution. That was Jordan and Israel. That happened already. Now we also have a third state that's run by Hamas in Gaza. And the Palestinian Authority doesn't speak for the Hamas-run state. And they're not overthrowing the Hamas-run state anytime soon. And in reality, the Palestinian Authority exists on the ground, and by the way, controls the day-to-day lives of 98% of the Arabs in Judea and Samaria, only because of Israel's quote occupation, right? If Israel weren't occupying Judea and Samaria, the Palestinian Authority would fall tomorrow, right? And that's only a slight exaggeration. It would certainly fall within a week. Mahmoud Abbas would be killed. His children would be probably killed too. And the hundreds of millions of dollars they've been squirreling away from international aid money would be up for grabs. And Hamas would ultimately take over. So that's the reality on the ground. You have 40 years of entrenched, deeply ingrained anti-Semitic education, if you want to call it that has affected deeply the views of the Palestinian Arabs in Judea and Samaria, let alone in Gaza. They don't believe, it's ironic if you think about it, like the Mufti of Jerusalem, the famous one, Haj Amin al-Husseini, the one who started the pogroms of Arabs against Jews in 1920, 1921, the 1929 Hebron massacre, in which every Jew in Hebron was either killed or ethnically cleansed from Hebron, the massacres in Jerusalem, the massacres in Sfat, the Mufti of Jerusalem, who became a Nazi collaborator and wanted the Nazis to come into British-controlled Palestine, and they might have been able to do that had the British not won the Battle of El Alamein in 1941. That Mufti of Jerusalem believed and wrote in his pamphlets about the Temple Mount that it was Jewish, it was a Jewish temple, and it was Solomon's stables were there. Today, the current Mufti of Jerusalem, who's paid for by the Palestinian Authority, teaches Palestinian Arabs that the Temple Mount has no connection to the Jewish people, right? So they're more radical now in many respects than the Nazi collaborator Mufti of Jerusalem was himself, right? So the status quo is going to be very difficult to change because we can't make peace with people, right, who believe we don't have a right to exist at all, right? So we have to change hearts and minds. That has to happen. I do believe that Naftali Bennett is right about economic incentives to change hearts and minds, but I believe that the folks at Habayit in Israel are also correct, and that we need to do much more to reach out to the Palestinians and treat them as our cousins and make them understand that we're indigenous to that land and that Jewish history began in that land and that every holiday we have is about that land, and to make it clear that, like you said, we're not going anywhere.
Yeah.
So that's my take on where things are for now, sadly. In terms of where I'd like to see things, I would love to see a situation where we could feel confident that we could grant autonomy to a Palestinian entity, Palestinian Arab entity in Judea and Samaria, and to create a federation with them in Jordan, where we all work to make the land more profitable and more beneficial for all the people in the land, including in Jordan.
Thank you.
Hey, and then Deborah, you're going to wind it up. Micha, try to speed things up because we're really running over time here.
Sorry, I guess very involved.
No, I know some of these questions, like Lawrence's questions, could have been an entire hour.
Right.
So just throwing it out there, Marty. I know the men's club there are usually an hour. I know we have held until 8 o'clock on the calendar, so we're inching towards it. So we're good to go. But yeah, we have been talking for a while, so we'll let y'all have a water break and a couple more questions.
Okay, Jay, and then Deborah.
Yeah, Micha, you basically addressed my first concern. There is some attractiveness to having a two-state solution in Judea and Samaria. However, the showstopper, as you pointed out, is they do not accept a Jewish state in the Middle East. And until they do, it's silly to talk about a two-state solution. And that has to change. And that's going to be a long way off. Now, the good news is it appears that in some of the negotiations, a lot of the settlements are nearer Israel. So it's not as hard as some people think to divide up Judea and Samaria into two portions. The other point I wanted to make is, and you didn't address this, is the right of return that the Palestinians claim as reinforced by the UN. Normally, the right of return has been applied to people that were kicked out of the country, and that would include Jews that were kicked out of the Middle East. Currently, though, the Palestinians are probably the only people that the UN has acknowledged that the descendants of the displaced people also have a right of return. And I think this also gets kids on campuses feeling that their rights have been taken away. And that's why we're seeing a lot of anti-Zionism on the campuses. So I don't know if you want to address that.
Certainly. So, the reality is that, one of the core causes of the conflict is the way the Palestinian and Arab refugee, situation was treated by the UN. Now, there is no legal right of return for the descendants of the Palestinian Arab refugees from the 1948 war. There's a UN General Assembly resolution, but that's not law. That doesn't have any force of law under international law. And the reality is that, Israel has always said that if there were to ever be a Palestinian state, then certainly that they govern their own immigration policies and they can have anybody become a citizen there they want. And if they want to say that the 11 million people who identify themselves as Palestinian in the world today can come there and be citizens, that's their prerogative. But certainly not a return to what is Israel itself. That would just destroy Israel. But it's also important, you touched on a very important issue with respect to this idea of refugees. There's two UN refugee organizations, the High Commission for Refugees and then UNRWA. And UNRWA, the High Commission for Refugees defines refugees the way it's always been defined, right? Basically, which is that if through a conflict or some natural disaster, you were forced out of your home and away from your country, right? You're a refugee. It doesn't apply that through heredity. Your grandchild isn't a refugee in that situation. Cubans living today, or I should say the descendants of Cubans living today in Miami, for example, are not considered Cuban refugees. Their grandparents who were forced out of Cuba by Castro or fled Castro, one way or the other, they were considered refugees. What the UN did when Israel became a state was that the UN defined, first of all, any Arab who had been in British-controlled Palestine from 1946 or before, and then who fled during the war of Israel's independence as a refugee, and then defined their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, etc., as refugees. That's unique to UNRWA. And it's important to understand that if you were an Arab in Iraq in 1942, and you saw that, frankly, because of those Zionists, that in British-controlled Palestine, there was a lot of jobs, better paying jobs for you than there were right now in Baghdad. And you moved to Jaffa to work there in 1942. And then in 1948, when the war broke out, you said, I'm not going to stick around for this war. I'm going to wait till this war is over. And you left. Under UNRWA, you and your kids and your grandkids and your great-grandkids are now refugees, right? So it's very important to understand how that UNRWA definition has vastly expanded what is considered to be a, quote, Palestinian refugee, well beyond that for any other group in the history of mankind. I'll take another question.
My turn?
Sure, Deborah.
Okay, so first of all, I would like to thank Beth Israel for organizing this. These are deep issues, and I think about them all the time, and thoughtful people disagree about them. So I would like to make the gentle criticism that with your broad definition of anti-Semitism, you have vastly simplified modern Jewish history. So I'm going to make a short list of people, individuals, and organizations that were born at the same time as Zionism in the early 20th century. Olah,
Deborah,
Shimon Dubno, Martin Booth.
Deborah, I'm going to mute you there for a second. If you could drop that in the chat, that would be more helpful. This is for questions, not comments. So if whatever list you've compiled, if you could drop that in the chat, that
All
would
right.
be more beneficial.
I'm sorry. Have I been muted
Thank
this
you.
whole question?
Well, no, I wanted to clarify. It's for questions, not comments. So if you have
Okay,
comments,
so here's my
those
question.
can go in the chat.
Martin Buber, Judah Magnus, the Bund, Olam. How do you, under your definition, because they were not Zionists, they were anti-Semites. They were non-Jewish, non-Zionist Jewish patriots and cultural innovators of the highest quality that our people has seen in those decades. Are they anti-Semites or self-hating Jews on your definition?
No, again, you're acting, there's a difference between being an anti-Zionist when Israel already exists and when Zionism has essentially proven itself to create the safe haven for the Jewish people, the safe haven from the Holocaust that we so desperately needed, the safe haven that it became for the 1 million Jews who were exiled and ethnically cleansed from the Arab-controlled dictatorships from Morocco to Iraq and down to Yemen, and being anti-Zionist or against against political Zionism before 1948. I mean, I think there's a huge difference there. And again, when you're saying at a time when the state of Israel has existed for over 73 years now, that you're against its existence, that is what I'm saying is anti-Semitic. That there were people when it was a theoretical idea, you know, in 1900, when my grandfather was born in Jerusalem as a fourth generation Jerusalemite, it was a theoretical idea that the approximately 80,000 Jews then living in Ottoman controlled Palestine could create a state. It was a theoretical idea that we could create a state that would be a safe haven for Jews, a place that would welcome Jews, be them who are being persecuted, whether they're being persecuted in Ethiopia, Ukraine, Morocco, or Germany, right? Those were theoretical ideas. And like you said, intellectual giants debated those ideas back then. But to debate the right of the Jewish people to a state today, after all that history, that's anti-Semitic.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions to close it out? I dropped in the chat. I've had a few private messages. People want the recording from tonight, and I know it's exciting. I will send it out afterwards, so I'll make sure to get that to everyone. So you that way you don't need to copy it from the chat or anything. Thanks, everyone. Well, seeing no hands, meaning we've solved all the world's problems, obviously. If you could share with us a bit of where we go from here, whether it's reading lists or articles or things that we can get involved in after hearing such a presentation, what can people like us do next?
Well, I think that, again, I've said this a lot of times in this context here today and in many other presentations that I've given, that I really think, education about Jewish history, indigeneity in the land of Israel, understanding what makes the people indigenous, and then being consistent in that, right? Being pro-indigenous rights everywhere, not just for Jews, but being pro-indigenous rights everywhere, for the Maori, for Native Americans, for standing up for Native American rights, for being consistent with those beliefs. I think that's critical to this. And again, for understanding that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, but also understanding that anti-Semitism comes from all sides, sadly. Horseshoe theory applied to us in the 1930s, and horseshoe theory applies to us today. There's a unique, the far left and the far right agree on very few things. But what they've always agreed on is hating us, and understanding that history and understanding that we can't be political about this. We have to call out the anti-Semites regardless of where they come from, whether we agree with their politics on other things or not, right? If Marjorie Taylor Greene is talking about the Rothschilds, she's an anti-Semite, whether you agree with her on other political issues or not. And when Ilhan Omar is talking about, Jews getting control of Congress through their Benjamins, right? She's being an anti-Semite, whether you agree with her on her other political issues or not. So I think that is the most important message, right? Is that we cannot be political when it comes to fighting anti-Semitism. We have to just call call these things as they are. And then in terms of reading, I mean, we've covered a lot of topics here today. I think one incredible book for people who are looking at understanding more about the very messy topic that is Israel, and also talking about Judea and Samaria, Gaza, the 1948 war. I'd read One Palestine Complete. I think that's a great book for people to read. It's very, very fair, very, very objective. It does not paint us as saints. And I would say, again, we're not saints, right? But that's not the standard, right? When the British fought the Germans in World War II, I would be the last person to call the British saints, but they were much more saintly than the Germans in that war, right? And so I think that's an important distinction.
Do you happen to know who wrote that book offhand?
I believe it's Segev.
Yeah, Micha, you may want to point out publications that are put out by Stand With Us. They have some very good.
Well, I would say, like, I mean, for reading material, if you're just not talking about books, but just looking for general reading material, just go to the Stand With Us website. Incredible resource.
Right.
All right, party people. I think this has been one of, I know Micha has spoken with our congregation before with the men's club about a year ago, actually. So this was a fantastic just update and kind of check back in to see where we can go from here. Oh, Beverly Brown, what's the name of that book again?
One Palestine Complete, and it is Tom Segev.
Awesome. Well, I can't say thank you enough. I mean, I know we've been looking forward to this for so long. And when we had our original planning meeting for this, Sari and I and David Bark was on the call as well. We were just so excited to get this on our calendar, and we hope to do this again with you soon. Oh, Lori, what else is an incredible resource? Okay, people want the books, man. They want the Amazon links. Hit us with some more books.
Okay, so hold on a second. I have a list here. So somewhere of my favorite books.
Yeah, give us a reading list.
Well, I would read, there's one great book that is fictional. It's a fiction book, but it's a fun read. And it's The Hajj by Leon Uris. So I would strongly, if anybody hasn't read The Hajj, I would recommend reading The Hajj. And when he ends that book, and by the way, it's written from the perspective of an Arab child growing up in a village near Yerushalayim in the early 1930s, right? And when he ends that book, and Leon Uris wrote that book in 1981, I think. You would think he wrote it at the end of, a year after September 11th, 2001. And so it's rather haunting, the way he concludes that book. But I think I would say that's a must read.
Okay, so everyone's going to go get that book and read it. We're going to come back in about a month and do a good group read book club, kind of a one book San Diego, but one book, Micha Danzig.
And I think From Time Immemorial is another great read that I would recommend. I'm trying to find I'll look up here who wrote it.
Lori was asking, you had mentioned a website or a blog.
The Stand With Us website.
There we go, the Stand With Us website.
Yeah, and From Time Immemorial by Joan Peters.
Marcia beat you to it. Yeah, Joan Peters. There it is in the chat.
Yeah. So I would highly recommend that. Wonderful.
Well, unless there's any other statements, closing remarks, I wanted to just thank Micha again for doing this for us.
Oh, yeah. And one other thing, Origins of the Six-Day War by Michael Oren.
Okay, I really do think we need to get a book club going.
I'm just thinking of all the books I've read in my past that they're coming to mind.
Awesome. Well, on behalf of the Israel Committee and the Men's Club and the Social Action Committee, again, this has been fantastic, and we look forward to working with you again soon. And for those of you that are viewing the recording, you can kind of skip back about 45 seconds to a minute to catch some of those book titles, write them down really fast, and we'll see you all next time.
Micha, thank you very much. We deeply appreciate this.
Of course, and it was my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks. Oh, I see Ruth Mastron is on. If anyone wants to volunteer at the House of Israel, hit her up. They're always looking for new volunteers. All right, I'll close out.